Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are excited for the second part of our four-part series talking about the SAT. We're going to give it just about 30 seconds, and then we are going to dive into content today. I am joined by a fantastic group, and we are looking forward to also bringing you, the audience, into our conversation today. So throughout the session, feel free to drop your name in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from or what school you might be connected to. Or if you're not connected to a school, let us know why this is an interesting topic for you. Also in the chat, you can drop in additional questions. At the very end, we're going to hold time for Q&A to make sure that your questions are answered along the way. So we're excited again to have you, and I'll give it just a second. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Good evening. My name is Sarah Marshall, and I serve as the executive director for Teach Indy. Teach Indy is an education nonprofit here in Indianapolis with a mission to recruit, develop, reward, and retain high quality, diverse educators for the schools in Indianapolis. We're really excited, as I mentioned, for the second of 4 sessions discussing data, but with the nuance of hearing from teachers and how they're really diving into data and using that to inform their instruction on a daily basis. I'm excited that I am joined today by a dear friend and an incredible data mind, Mia Kern, and I'm going to turn things over to her to introduce herself and introduce our panelists.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Mia Kern. I am the manager of special projects and data at the Mind Trust. The Mind Trust is an education nonprofit based here in Indianapolis that helps launch and support high quality schools. We're also working to transform the education landscape so that race and income no longer predict life outcomes. And I've introduced myself now a little bit. I will let our 2 panelists introduce themselves in their role as well.
I can jump in there. Hi, I'm Katie Dorsey. I work at Herron Classical Schools as the Vice President of Strategic Planning, but I am recently off the job of Head of School at Herron Riverside High School, and I was very glad to do that work for the last 5 years and through the first running of the state's implementation of the SAT test.
Hi, I am Bonnie McNeely, and I am one of the founding math teachers at Herron Riverside High School, but I'm also serving as a math interventionist for all of Herron Classical Schools. And I'm really excited about the work that we're doing with the SAT.
Thank you so much, Bonnie and Katie, for giving us your time this evening. We know it's precious, and we really appreciate what you're getting ready to share. I wanted to just kind of outline the session for today and what we're going to kind of be diving into. So again, this is the second session. The first session, we spent some time talking to educators about what we've learned from the iLearn data. Today, we're going to be focused on SAT, but you'll notice on the screen, we also have 2 additional dates. In January, we're going to be looking at foundations data. So what is the data that we should be looking at in kindergarten through 2nd grade? And then we'll finish up in March with a session focused on serving special education students and what that data is telling us. So today, we're going to be looking at statewide data related to the SAT. Then we're going to dig into Marion County data. We'll have a chance to then talk to our educators. And again, we'll then transition to Q&A. As I said earlier, if you have any questions for our great panelists, please feel free to just drop those in the chat along the way. And we'll be sure to hold time at the end for questions. And with that, I get to turn it over to Mia to really talk us and walk us through the data. So thanks, Mia.
Sure. So before we get into the teacher talk, let's break down the data a little bit. So why is it important to look at data? We recognize that one assessment doesn't tell the full story, but it does let us measure progress and adjust our teaching approaches based on the trends that we're seeing, whether that's modifying what isn't working or capitalizing on what is. So you might have heard of the College Board's SAT. It's used nationwide as a college admissions test. In Indiana, the SAT is taken each spring by all public school students in grade 11. This is a new requirement. It was adopted previously last year in 2021, 2022. The previous state assessments for high schoolers were the ISEP 10 and the ECA graduation assessments. Federal dollars are usually tied to the administration of the assessment, and it can be a great tool for families and educators to understand the strength and knowledge gaps that students have. As this was the first year of statewide administration, it's important for us to examine it in order to establish a baseline and a starting place for moving forward. It's also used to inform school and district letter grades, teacher evaluations, student supports, and so much more. As I've mentioned before, it's also used as a measure of college readiness. Some colleges and universities use the SAT as an entrance exam qualifier, and some scholarships also rely on SAT scores in selection criteria. So let's look at how the SAT is scored. Sorry, if we can go back. Yeah, there we go. It scores range from 200 to 800, and there are two subjects. It's evidence-based reading and writing, or EBRW, and then math. And then there's a possible composite score of 1600. So the table here on the right shows the cutoff scores that are used in Indiana to determine if a student is at benchmark, approaching benchmark, or below the benchmark. These benchmarks are set by the College Board and noted here with a star. A student is considered proficient on the SAT if they reach the at benchmark level on both the math and the EBRW sections. And then a school or district's overall proficiency rate is the percentage of students who are at benchmark on both sections of the test. All right, so today we'll also prioritize looking at data across different student groups to understand how all students are learning, as a school's overall proficiency rate doesn't usually tell the full story. So we'll look at data statewide across Marion County districts, and then for our schools that are joining us, we'll look at overall data, and we will also break it down across 3 racial ethnic subgroups. All right, so looking at the statewide data, there have been a lot of changes, as I've mentioned, between 2019 and 2022 that make it hard to compare scores across time. So we're just going to look here at the data from this recent school year. I've got the percent of testers across the different subgroups, and then the both at benchmark, that's both the reading and the math portions, and then I've broken those out individually. So looking at all students statewide, we're seeing just under 30% that were proficient on both sections, 50 in math, and then 30% in, 50 in reading and then 30% in math. And then for our Black students and Latino students, we do see quite a dip below that. And then we see our white students there as well, so we can look at those gaps. Now we'll focus in on the Marion County data. This includes all public schools in Marion County, the 11 township/districts. And then for the purposes of this analysis, we've grouped together independent and innovation charter schools that are represented as a combined single district. So I will be throwing a lot of numbers at you here, but we will provide links at the end of this talk where you can go and dig into the data yourself. But here we've got Marion County data for reading on the left and the math on the right. You can notice where we see higher performance, specifically like Speedway is doing really well. And then our innovation schools and our charter school performance is listed on the bottom. And I'll pause here for a second if you want to just take a look and point out any trends as you're watching.
Hey, Mia, a quick question. One of the things that I'm seeing, and I know we're going to dig into this a little bit more, is just the difference between the reading and math. I know we'll talk about that in a little bit, but do you have any sense for whether that is kind of like normal across the state, and also how we see that trending across other states? Has math just been a significant, has it been lagging significantly?
Yeah, from what I've seen, that is the trend. We also saw that with the iLearn data, which is the assessment that's given to 3 through 8 students. It's been historical. I think that we also saw some of those gaps between the subjects widen a bit as a result of the pandemic. And I believe that we're seeing similar trends like on a nationwide scale too. But yeah. Okay. All right, so this table shows the performance of each of the districts in Marion County, again, with the charter schools kind of combined together into one district for comparison purposes. IPS or Indianapolis Public Schools is listed there at the top. And then we've got all of our subgroups as well for today. And then on the next slide, it's the same graph. We've just compared that to state data so we can see how all of our schools in Marion County are performing when compared to the state as a whole. So I'll stop here and I'll ask our awesome educators that are joining us if there's anything that stands out to them about the Marion County data that they're seeing and specifically about the subgroup data.
I think all educators in Central Indiana and really in the state can first just recognize the modest results. And certainly it doesn't feel like a success when you're looking at capping out at 30% of a subgroup or a student group reaching the passing rate. And so that's the first. It's humbling and certainly challenging. And then even more so when you can see the wide gaps and disparities that exist between the different demographic subgroups. And I think that is the conversation that I have been a part of and have been hearing is we now have really recent data of the impact of COVID and the last couple of years of learning on widening what we've seen historically as an achievement gap.
And I'll just add to that I think this just highlights what we already knew, which was that it is now time to really dig in and realign our curriculum with what the SAT is going to be asking students to do. I think it's been difficult combined with the COVID times and along with having students taking at some points 3 different tests. We're doing some students are still doing the ISTEP, some students are doing the ASVAB, and then we added in the SAT. Now we have a chance to really catch our breath and work on realigning that curriculum, and hopefully we'll see these pass rates go up.
Yeah, Bonnie, I was thinking something like really similar is there has been so much transition here. I think it's really nice that we now know we have a baseline. And my hope is that we all see this data not as a gotcha moment, but Katie, just like you said, an opportunity for reflection and then to pause and say, okay, there are actually some places where we need a lot of support and we need to really dig in. There's also some places and some bright spots. And Mia, you mentioned Speedway, for example. I think this lends us an opportunity to think about how do we partner and figure out who's doing what right. And that's why I'm excited the two of you are on, because you all have some really powerful data to share. But I think it's an important time. It reminds me of what Eddie Ronhell from Adelante said in the last session. It is humbling, and now we need to take a look at it, and then we can only go up from here, but we have to do that together. So we should all kind of be surrounding educators to make sure we're all moving forward, regardless of where our students attend school. So just excited to hear from you all, but those were just my thoughts after hearing you both talk about it.
Yeah, and on our next slide, I took a chance to uplift the great work that the Heron schools are doing. So this is both of the Heron schools, Heron High School and then Riverside High School. Their scores for the SAT are outlined here with the green fill showing where they outscored the state for that subject and subgroup, and then the darker green fill showing where they outscored the state by over 10 percentage points. Red indicates that the subject and subgroup were below the state average, although none were greater than 10 percentage points lower, which means that across the board, the Heron schools are on par or above the state in performance. So now I have the pleasure of handing it over to Sarah and our panelists to talk about how they use this data on a daily basis to support their students and their families.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mia. I think before we transition to questions, Heron team, I'd love for you to just hear your reactions to seeing your data on the screen. What are you thinking about as it relates to just kind of the scores and raw numbers?
I have a feeling Bonnie's going to say something very similar because she and I have been in a lot of meetings together about this going back to basically the week the data came out. But for us, these are not just percentages and subgroups. These are students. And I can tell you the names of our 11th graders last year who were Black students who took the test and whether or not they met these marks. And so it feels very personal. And in that regard, there are some victories. I love seeing a square that is bright green, dark green, but to just be above a state average is not our goal in and of itself. And so really looking at who has not yet demonstrated that proficiency and what do we owe them? How do we make adjustments so that we really have all of our students, we're increasingly closer to all of our students able to demonstrate this level of proficiency, really so they have options after high school. We know that SAT has a very large sample size. It's a nationally normed exam. And so you can also look at certain score thresholds being linked to an increased percent likelihood of success in post-secondary. And so it's not kind of a random goal. It's a goal that allows us to then say this student now has all the doors open. If they choose to go to a 4-year or 2-year institution, they're going to have the skills necessary to be successful. So we look at this data and are immediately humbled and challenged. There are some victories, but you just look just at our Latino student line and you see the work we have to do.
Yeah, I think this is very much, I can see the faces of these students as we talk about them. And I've been using the words access and opportunity quite a bit with our faculty about, this is not about gaming some kind of a test. This is about helping our students even that playing field, close that gap, provide them with the access and opportunity that they need as a jumping off point to go out and be really successful. And one way that they can do that is through, meeting this benchmark on the SAT, because that can lead to scholarships. It can lead to, acceptance into college, all of those things that we want for our students.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that that insight. And as always, I always appreciate talking to educators who are really quick to say, "Oh, here's all the things we need to grow." But I appreciate you also acknowledging the places that you're that there are bright spots, Katie, that you mentioned, and the spirit of consistently trying to get better. So let's dive into some more questions about SAT data. And actually, Bonnie, you had a kind of a nice segue here also. But Katie, I'm curious from your perspective, we have a lot of people that are naysayers about just testing in general. So from your perspective, either as a principal or in the seat that you sit in now, is it important to look at SAT data and why? Why should we be focusing on it so much?
Yes. And I think I've maybe mentioned a couple of these things in previous responses, but especially a test that has a lot of evidence and norming data that we know is being vetted highly and then aligned to success in post-secondary, we need the SAT to give us feedback on the appropriateness of our instruction, because it allows us to then analyze, are we interpreting the state standards at the appropriately rigorous way? Are we then presenting students with, I love Bonnie's phrase, with access and opportunity to receive that high level instruction, because we know that they can succeed and thrive when we do that. And that one of the first hurdles we have to overcome is just not presenting students with appropriately rigorous instruction. So the SAT really gives us feedback as educators. We're teaching a student in Algebra 2. What is the outcome of that class? What are the skills that they have at the end of that? And how would they compare to if they sat in an Algebra 2 class somewhere else in the country, somewhere else in the state? And what does it mean for the likelihood that they can pass a college algebra class if they want to as a 19-year-old? And so absolutely, it's important to look at SAT data. And for us as an organization, we've used advanced placement coursework, AP coursework, also from College Board for the entire history of our schools, because it is also a vetted, normed, rigorous set of assessments that we can then filter into our instruction. And so this aligns with the work we do in those courses and will give us now annual feedback, even more than that when we also look at the PSAT as to what the results of our instruction are.
And Katie, in case somebody doesn't know what the PSAT is, can you share kind of the difference and maybe how that helps to support the work?
Absolutely. So there's a PSAT 8-9 for 8th and 9th graders, and they are presented with content that is at the 9th grade level. So College Board has adjusted the test questions. It's not just the exact same questions. And so students who demonstrate proficiency on the PSAT, you would expect them to keep learning. And then when they take the SAT as a junior, the test questions are a little harder, but the PSAT would have given us that feedback in 8th, 9. And then there's also the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test for juniors in the fall, again, to give us feedback on how they're doing in progression of the set of skills that College Board has chosen to test on the SAT.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie, for that additional context. Bonnie, anything to add to that first remark from Katie, or I'm also happy to transition to that second question.
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think she answered it
Okay.
well.
Awesome, thanks. So with that transition, Bonnie, you've been at the school since its inception. You are like an incredible educator focused on math and now coaching teachers. I'm really curious about that transition since we mentioned the test shifting a couple times. How did your team kind of make the transition from iStep to SAT? And what, if anything, have you adjusted or coached differently for classroom instruction?
So I think number one, this is very much an evolving conversation. We are in the early stages of making that transition because up until a year ago, we were still trying to get some of our students prepared for iStep. But I think I started at Heron, I guess 8 years ago. And I remember at that time working on just these question banks and writing iStep style questions and building those into our lessons. And that's very much still a big piece of the framework from which we're all working today. And so I think we're now back in 8 years later, a phase in which we have to take a hard look at how our curriculum aligns with what the SAT is asking students to accomplish. So one of the things we've talked about is transitioning away from these multi-step open response problems that iStep asks students to do and focusing more on how do you take a multiple choice test that requires like a short amount of time that you can do each problem that also requires a lot of reading to be successful. So those are the pieces that we're considering now. And I think the early inception of that is making sure everybody in the math department is really familiar with what those SAT style questions look like. And now we're starting to take a look at which teachers have been really successful, like which of their students are doing really well in the SAT and what can we steal and glean from their classroom and their instruction. I feel really thankful to work in a school and a district that's very collaborative. So we're all sharing lessons anyway. We're all sharing assessments. And so nobody's really working in isolation. And then we have a few kids coming up with these amazing results and everybody else is in the dark. Everybody's sharing, everybody's working together, everybody's planning together as we move forward through this process.
Thank you so much for like breaking that all the way down to like exactly how you all are collaborating. As a math teacher myself, a former math teacher, I'm also just so impressed with you saying like the reading portion is critical for math instruction. I think oftentimes we don't see that correlation, and you have to be able to like read the context and read the problem to be able to get out and do the mathematics. So I'm glad that your team is really focused on that. The inner like math geek in me is really excited with the care that you all are taking. So let's talk about that next question, because we know SAT isn't the only data set that you all are analyzing. And so Katie, I'm curious from kind of what you're thinking about. What other data sets have been helpful to measure kind of college and career readiness from your perspective? And especially for those maybe that are joining us that are, newer high school teachers, what is some other data that they can be using to leverage?
Yeah, I think one that is getting a lot of traction, and certainly we've acted on it, is 9th grade on track. So we know credit attainment. So how many credits has a student earned each semester? If they need 40 to graduate, then they need at least 5 each semester at minimum. And we know that actually in a student's freshman year is the number one predictor alongside their GPA of on-time graduation and also graduating college ready, post-secondary ready. So just as an example, our counselors at both Heron and Heron Riverside just did freshman success meetings with our 9th grade students who were not passing at least 2 classes. And looking at trying to have that early intervention, there's still time this semester. Bonnie teaches many of these students and can picture that transition to high school can be so challenging. And for many students, credits, middle school does not focus on credit attainment necessarily, and how important it is to be making significant progress toward graduation. and I think the GPA, I mentioned it, is folded in there, but we know that GPA is actually also a really big predictor of success in college. And a GPA is just the average of the numbers that are assigned to the letter grades that you get on a high school transcript or on your courses. And so when we are looking at interventions and are tiering the types of supports that students get, those are two other areas that we pay close attention.
Thank you, Katie. And we linked the resource. So it was the 9th grade on track. So we put that in the chat so that folks know to take a look at that. That seems like a really helpful resource. Bonnie, I think you started to kind of dance around this 4th question already. But in particular, we looked at the previous slides based on racial subgroups, right? And the data is humbling that we have students that based on their race or ethnicity, right? We know we have a predictor currently of how they'll do on the assessment. So I'm curious, I know you all are doing a lot of interventions and doing a lot to close the gap, but how are you specifically leveraging your subgroup data to kind of close that achievement gap between white students and maybe their either Black or Latino peers?
I think for us, it's very much about individual students again. So I think we have just so much data at hand. We have a data team that works closely with our math and English departments specifically, and I have so much data about kids at my fingertips. So like I can speak from like a freshman student perspective because I teach Algebra 1. When my students enroll in my class, I know immediately how they're going to do. Like the data that I have at hand is just outstanding. And so we can right away, when students enroll with us, suggest additional supports that might help them be more successful. So we've got a variety of support classes that go alongside the math classes that they're in. I know Katie is really passionate about this, and through her, I've learned more about this, about making sure that struggling learners are also presented with on grade level content. And so it's really important to us that we're not keeping students out of appropriate grade level instruction, but instead providing additional support alongside that for gaps that they might have in their learning. And that's very much happening on a student by student basis, both in our English and in our math departments. I think additionally, we've been able to create some pull-out instruction this year with our bubble students. And so that's happening at both schools, and we've been able to work in really small groups with those students who are like transparently doing very well in their math classes, and that's been hard for students and families to understand. But I think we're just not quite there in understanding what the rigor of the SAT looks like. Those students have been a little surprised, I think, by that. And so I think these small groups have been really valuable in that way.
I think one thing I would add to that, specifically thinking about our Latino student population, for us at Riverside, that sometimes means the student is also an English language learner, and not always, but sometimes that is the case. And College Board has pretty strict guidelines on what types of accommodations are available to those students. That often does not include extra time. They might get access to a word-to-word dictionary, but gosh, you have to be able to use that quickly in the time allotted. And so for us, it's really important that anyone who works directly or indirectly with our English language learners has a really strong knowledge of the SAT, and we can provide as much wraparound support as we possibly can in every setting and context to help prepare them to demonstrate the knowledge that they have on this assessment. And so I think it's a challenge in an area that I actually hope College Board maybe becomes more responsive to, and giving students who are still learning English a chance to demonstrate proficiency in the skills without the barrier of English literacy being kind of preventing that from happening. But it's another area I know, just for example, in one of Bonnie's classes last spring, she had a big group of students who were English language learners, and we tried like everything. How can we support these students in math? Put in not only faculty in to support, but actually tapped a senior bilingual student who is really strong in math to walk in as a peer tutor and to be a teaching assistant for Bonnie. Maybe you should just speak about it because it was your class, Bonnie. But just one example of, that's what the subgroup data means to us is, yes, this is a Latino student, and sometimes that means they're also an English language learner.
Yeah, I think it can be tempting for some people outside of what's actually happening to say, like, oh, it's math, like math is universal. And that's actually not the case, particularly not when we look at the level of the content that students are being asked to do on the SAT. The reading and the decoding that those students are going to need to know is going to be a real challenge for anybody who's an English language learner. So I think it's really important that we treat those students with the right level of support, as much levels of support that we can provide.
Thank you both for those answers. And Katie, in transparency, I had no idea that there wasn't extended time, particularly for folks in like levels 1 and 2. So that is something that's really important, I think, for people to just know and understand as it relates to this assessment. So that actually helps us to segue a little bit about how you all are thinking about, kind of elevating this to students directly and also helping parents and community understand. And so we'll go to the next slide, but I'm also going to remind folks that are joining us live that if you have additional questions that you want to make sure that Katie and Bonnie respond to, please feel free to drop those into the chat for us. And we are going to hold time after this next set of questions that we have with our panelists for your questions. So feel free to drop those in the chat. So let's dig into kind of how you are now taking this data from your internal and then thinking about these externally. So Katie, can you talk to us a little bit about how the school is supporting students and families in understanding kind of the students' data and what this means?
Yeah, so here's my chance to be transparent. This is a big push for us because our focus really from spring until now has been making sure our educators feel incredibly competent and confident and proficient on the test. And we actually know that parents and students deserve that same sort of effort and energy into helping them understand why the SAT is important, what that data says about their student, how their student can prepare as well as they can. And that actually that is one of the ways that you maximize the supports that you're providing during the school day is to also equip families to have those conversations at home, provide their own support and preparation. As a parent myself, I think if my child were being assessed on a test I didn't understand, there's a big gap there. And so I think we have been having more conversations lately about what does this communication look like? And kind of most pressing, PSAT results from fall assessment will come out in early December. So an opportunity as we help our students and families access those scores to do so through the lens of why do I need to know about this? What does it mean? What's the PSAT? What's the SAT? And luckily there are some great resources out there once you have your PSAT scores that can help you make significant progress toward preparing for the SAT. So I think we owe that to our students and families, and it is one of the ways that we need to strengthen the work that we do.
That's helpful. And I appreciate your transparency in, I think, again, it's a new assessment, right? Or it's not new, but kind of new as a graduation qualifier or new as a required exam. So it makes sense that you all are still working on what is that just right way to explain kind of these results. As you were thinking of, or as you were talking, I was also looking at that second question of who are you working with kind of in the community to also come alongside and support with college and career readiness. And I will, Katie, maybe we'll start with you, but Mia, I'd also love to throw this one over because I know the Mind Trust is also doing some support with high schools and wondering, what kind of resources might be available. So Katie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I've really seen the city, including the Mind Trust, the state, and then our network try to catch up quickly and making sure that high quality proven resources are being made available in a way that if you picture iLearn, there are lots of state initiatives right now to support elementary schools and teachers and families with literacy and elementary math skills. And so I think just a couple that we've utilized the state, and if you're an educator, you might want to be aware of Gear Up. It's a program in partnership with Purdue University to equip educators with the knowledge of the test. So kind of like step one, what is the test? So we engaged with their trainings over the summer. And there are other organizations like that that help you just kind of rip the Band-Aid off if you are teaching a content area and you don't have a strong knowledge of the SAT, rather than pursuing that individually and saying, all right, I guess I have to become an expert on my own. I know the Mind Trust is helping identify and package some of these training resources as well. And that has been step one for us.
Yeah, and at the Mind Trust, knowing that we were going to see this shift to the SAT as the major state assessment, we started working with several high schools on targeted SAT prep for students. We want to see if high quality preparation materials over multiple years during school hours can be a strong support or investment for schools.
Yeah, that's great, Mia. I think, again, given the kind of the newness of so many students taking the assessment, I think it'll be exciting over time to see those supports come alongside schools. And then I think, 3 years from now, I hope this conversation is we have additional resources that we can elevate both for parents and teachers, but also for schools that are seeking supports, which is great. So we're starting to kind of wind down our session, but I did want to ask Bonnie, for new educators that are listening, or that are going to be seeing, the session later, do you have like maybe one resource or tool, could be a support that that you would recommend to teachers who are interested in just better using their data? That would be helpful.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
So I think that it can feel really overwhelming to a full-time classroom teacher to sort of overhaul their curriculum in the middle of the school year. And I've been struck by, as I dig into our data and how our students are doing, that so often it is not the actual math content that is causing students to miss questions. It's more about how the question is phrased, how the question looks, using logic, those types of things. And so I think it can be a challenge for teachers to all of a sudden write all of their questions in that particular style, but it's so important to make sure students have access to those questions. So I think my recommendation would be Khan Academy has a great free SAT prep course. But what's ideal about it is we can connect that with students' College Board. And so it is using their individualized data to drive that instruction. And they are being given questions that are tailored to their strengths and weaknesses on the PSAT. So I think like that is something that teachers just don't have enough hours in the day to actually do effectively, that Khan Academy will do for students automatically. So I've been recommending that not just to teachers, but also to students and families for outside of school.
That is really helpful. My personal connection, my niece is taking geometry. It's been a while since I've taught it in Khan Academy. It has so many amazing resources that make learning accessible to students, and I did not know that it connects to College Board. So Bonnie, thank you so much. So I want to make sure that we're holding time. If anyone has any questions that they want to add to the chat, I'll give it just a second. But maybe one more question that I have while we wait for anything to get added. And that question is, let me make sure, what is like one action specifically that you would encourage teachers to use to close that achievement gap, Bonnie? Like, what is that one resource? Is it Khan Academy? Is it something else? Is it just looking at the data broken down by subgroups? Like, how would you encourage a new teacher to be thinking about leveraging subgroup data?
I think for me, it has been really powerful just to present these questions to my students and see what their responses are, because I don't think I had an understanding of what was tripping them up. Because so often I'm like, oh, this is an Algebra 1 question. The student who's in Algebra 2 should be able to answer this really easily. But students are not familiar with what those questions look like. They're not familiar with the vocab frequently, and those kinds of things throw them off. So the more frequently we can put those types of questions in front of students and help them understand, there was a question I was looking at the other day that was all about going to Mars and space travel. And at the end of the day, when you decode that question, you don't need to know anything. You don't need to understand anything about Mars or space travel to actually answer the question itself. And the more students can see that and recognize that, the more access we provide them to those types of questions, the better off they'll be.
And I think I will maybe even generalize that a little bit to something that I know Bonnie values and supports her teachers that she works with on too, and that it's just providing really targeted feedback to students. That an assessment with a grade at the end of it without feedback on where a student went wrong or what patterns in their thinking the teacher noticed, and especially that feedback in the moment. So I think being able to practice and then receive feedback about what direction your thinking took you in and what's a way to use the strengths and skills that you have to pursue an answer. It's an area that we value a lot as instructors and as educators. And as students are orienting themselves to the SAT, we just owe that to them rather than just, here's your score, hope you do better next time. How can we give them a lot of practice and then a lot of feedback?
Thank you both so much for just the insight that you were able to provide through these questions. We don't have any questions in the chat, but that doesn't mean that there aren't lots that are floating out there. So I would love to just share some valuable resources that we have elevated. Also in the chat, we've been able to add a couple of the resources that were referenced during the session today. So please feel free to check out the chat. But in the on the screen and also in the chat here, you're going to see some just Department of Education resources, as well as an overview that captures the data that we shared that Mia walked through. There are some resources, question banks, etc., that you can research. And then lastly, a great Chalkbeat article that kind of summarizes what we saw across various schools that would be helpful for you to know. So all of that is in the chat for folks that are looking for resources. And then if you have a question that didn't get answered tonight, we would welcome that. You can email us at info@teachindynow.org, and we will happily connect you either with a resource or hopefully with Katie or Bonnie. If you're an educator that has an educator specific question, we'd love to connect the two of you. So we're closing out for the evening. I just want to say a huge thank you once again to my co-moderator, Mia Kern. Thank you so much for your insight and for your data sharing this evening. And Bonnie and Katie, thank you so much for everything you do for kids on a daily basis and for giving us your time this evening and sharing your insight because it is so incredibly beneficial to teachers. We have one last slide because I do want to remind you that we've got one more session coming up here in the next, in the new year. So January 24th, we're going to be digging into K2 data, right? If we think about it, what happens in those kindergarten and second grade, all the way up through second grade really actually impacts exactly what Katie and Bonnie are talking about when they get to 10th grade, 11th grade, et cetera. So we hope that you will join us again on the 24th of January. Thank you again to our panelists, and thanks to those that are watching. We will see you soon.